Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nerdy Pastor. This is my annual reading sabbatical, reading week. It's kind of a vacation, but not a vacation. You're in the office, but you're not working on your normal sermon. You're not doing your normal staff meetings. You're not visiting with all the congregational needs, and still doing some prayer ministry, of course, with folks and responding to emails, some things like that, and having some meetings, but not the standard work of the week. You're taking a Sabbath from that, and for a week, kind of reading some books that are more for your own personal and professional development. So I thought I would just share with you what my 2023 reading sabbatical is comprised of, what I'm going to be reading book-wise, started to read already book-wise, and share that with you. So typically, this has been in the past more of just my own professional, but as the older you get, the more you realize how much of a fool you are all the time. So you start to include more things on just a personal level for personal development as well, instead of just professional development. So for me, it's somewhere in between. It's kind of a balance of those things that I'll be including in my reading week. So first, I'll start off with some of the professional stuff that I'll be reading and share that with you, and then talk about some of the personal books that I'll be reading for more of my own personal growth and development, and spending time, of course, also in prayer over these things and matters that I read about and study. So, first book I've started is kind of a well-known book in the Presbyterian Church, is Guy Prentice Waters' book, How Jesus Runs the Church. Really, what he does here is he goes through an introduction with Reformed theology, covenant theology, how that works, how there's one people of God. He makes that real clear and does a good job of sharing that, because a lot of people that will read this book might not read the Bible that way. So it helps to lay the foundation of how it works, in the sense that the Bible fits together in a covenantal understanding, which is very helpful. Then he moves through the different ways that we understand the offices of the church, the officers of the church. Then he talks about the power of the church, which I think is probably well worth the whole price of the book. It's about $15 book or so. But that third chapter on the power of the church, wow, what a needed chapter for anyone going into the ministry or in the ministry, about where power and authority and those things come from. Of course, it comes from Christ and the Spirit through the means of the Scriptures, but also there's vested authority, in the officers. So it's representative authority, it's ministerial authority, it's vested authority, but it's also not personal, in internal or intrinsic authority. It's from the Lord. It's a gift, but it's a stewardship. So some profound stuff in this book, and then he's got some practical thoughts at the very end on how this works in, of course, church ministry. So fantastic book here. Another book that I've been reading a little bit here and there, and starting to kind of go through the rest of it, is a famous Scottish minister from, I think he was 17th century. Yep. 17th century, James Durham, famous minister of his time, one of the greatest preachers and probably theologians in his day in the Scottish church. But it's a book, it's called Undisciplined Disciples. Kind of a foreboding title there, but it's called actually The Scandal of the Undisciplined Disciple. So this is talking, he's got this fantastic, well-known work on church discipline that he wrote way back in the 17th century, that Reformation Heritage Books have divided up into a 4-part series that are very helpful. And I'll share the other one with you here that's more on a personal level that I'm reading as well. But really, really technical book, but very helpful on understanding how to make choices biblically and scripturally and reasonably and pastorally in disciplining people for the goal of restoration, right? Very helpful book, but pretty challenging book. I've read about half of it so far. Pretty hard book to read, but very, very helpful in how to administer discipline the right way. So very, very good book here. Another couple books on church professional things is I read through this very short pamphlet on parliamentary procedure for Presbyterians, done by Jacob Gerber. Very, very helpful. It kind of is paired, of course, with the PCA's approved Robert Rules of Order Newly Revised edition. So you kind of need to read these as a pair. In this revised edition, you can read it in about 2 hours, probably. Pretty simple. But I'm going to review this again this week, and I've read through this one already for a pretty quick read. But these are essentially, why should we be an orderly church? How should we be an orderly church? What's the benefits of an orderly church? Well, a lot of things. I won't go into all that, but essentially it helps our church maintain impartiality and clarity as we make judgment decisions. Because in the Presbyterian Church, the session, okay, the ruling body of elders is a court. It's a courtroom. We're not coming up with legislation. The Bible gives us that. The Bible tells us what to be doing. The Bible tells us what to be about. We don't come up with human traditions and human rules to impose upon people. But we are called to steward those principles and to steward faithfully following Christ with other people. So we are called to make judgment calls, to make decisions that are judgments. So that's why we're called a court. And that's why that's the primary issue, that we need order. As they say, order in the court. That's what we need. We need orderly courtroom procedure. These two books of Robert's Rules and this Parliamentary Procedures for Presbyterians, very, very helpful. I just shared that with all of our elders. Both those books, gave those to them to review and to read as we get into the new year. It's very helpful. And then, of course, a classic book on building healthy churches and healthy ministries is Mark Dever and Paul Alexander's book, How to Build a Healthy Church. Read through about half of this book and going to finish the rest of it. Obviously, they come more from the Reformed Baptist tradition, but there's a lot of overlap here. Some very, very, very good stuff here for ministers and elders especially to consider on how to build healthy churches. I think there's an unhealthy attraction to building big churches. The goal that Jesus has is to build healthy churches. If it's big or if it's small, what more matters to Christ is that he is in front. He is first. The church is healthy, not the church is big but unhealthy, or small and unhealthy, but healthy, whether it's big or small. So this book kind of gives the focus on health, church health, which I think is absolutely important for all churches, not just my church, the church I'm a part of, or our denomination, but for all Christian churches. And lastly, more of a theology textbook in a way that I think is wonderful. And I've read chapters of it at different times, and I really have always wanted to get around to reading the rest of it. And it's kind of a fascinating book that's been published by Erdman's a number of years ago, called God's Two Words, Law and Gospel in the Lutheran and Reformed Traditions. So what's the relationship between the gospel and the law? Well, what do the two main Reformation traditions teach on that? So, I mean, it's got a who's list of authors here writing about these two distinct, though connected, how connected, right? Views on how they relate and don't relate. The chapters are tied, or the parts are broken down into: the law is not the gospel. Part 2, the gospel is not the law. Part 3, law and gospel in theology and ministry. And Part 4, Lutheran and Reformed responses. So it's really kind of an intramural debate between the Lutherans and the Reformed on how do we put together, or not, the law and the gospel. And this has been a long-standing feud in our two traditions. So some really good, pretty highly technical stuff here, but a book I've been meaning to read the rest through, and I've got some time this week, so I'm going to be doing that. So what about personal books for my own just personal sanctification, my own personal growth in grace and knowledge of Christ? What are some books I'm going to consider? Well, these 4 books. The first is that other book by James Durham, actually the second of 4 books, but he's got a personal appeal to ministers to avoid failure, moral failure. So Preventing Ministry Failure by James Durham. And a very, very concise, hard-hitting book. It's got little chapters on all these main areas to give consideration to, and I would say it's very scrupulous. The sins in relation to preaching. I've already read that one. Okay. Sins in relation to baptism, Lord's Supper. Sins in relation to church government, to national political affairs, the necessity of holy ministers, sins before ordination, sins of personal life. I mean, it just kind of goes on and on and on. But these are very good things to consider, because ultimately the church is to be healthy and holy. So the ministers need to be healthy and holy spiritually, right? Healthy and holy from a spiritual sense, because those are the people God is setting apart to primarily give God's word to people, to direct people in the ministry. So if you're not healthy, how are you going to direct other people that need health? If you're not holy, how are you going to direct people towards holiness like God? So a very helpful book, and a hard-hitting book, but needed. So a book I'll be reading. This is a great, really helpful book that goes through kind of a biblical theology of anger. It's called the Heart of Anger, and it was written a couple years ago by Christopher Ashe and Steve Midgley. And I've started the book. Oh, it might have been last year, but I haven't continued it. And it wasn't because I was angry, but I need to read through this because I think men especially struggle mightily with anger. It's certainly one of the greatest struggles, along with lust, along with pride. I think for men, it's primarily anger issues are so common. It says in Ephesians 6:4, men, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Why? Because you're always angry. So, right? So there's a sense of this is a primary issue for men. So I'm going to be giving my attention to this biblical theology of leaving, unrighteous anger, of knowing righteous anger, as it says at the very end here, approaching love with Christ, peace with Christ, joy with Christ, and exposing the agenda of our anger. So it's a very helpful book on exposing unrighteous anger, encouraging right kinds of righteous anger, very few and far between, and then encouraging peace with Christ. Very, very helpful. Of course, a very recent book that just came out. Been meaning to read it, bought it right when it came out. This is, I think, Tim Keller's last book before he passed. It is Forgive. Tim Keller's book. Why should I and how can I? It's interesting when you really think through your life that you think you've forgiven people for things that they've done to you, or you've received their forgiveness or whatever. And it's amazing how often you realize you have not done that. And you need to. It's not a gift in the sense of it's not something that just comes naturally and easy. It's a gift in the truth by grace, but it's something that you continue to trust God in and work with God in His grace to arrive at that forgiveness in the sense of your horizontal relationships with people. It's not this automatic thing like it is in a sense with God. That's why it's so challenging. The Bible says, if God forgives you, you need to forgive others. He's been tenderhearted with you, you be tenderhearted with others. It takes that command. See, it takes God telling you, now you go do the same because I've done this for you. So that's what I mean by that. It takes God's grace. It's all from God's grace, but it ultimately involves obedience to God's commands to forgive. It's hard. So a beautiful book on this that's been well received, and I'm really excited to read that book. And lastly, I got this book a number of years ago from a used bookstore. And I really thought, further along in ministry, as I get beat up in ministry and I start to get more worn out by ministry, this would be a healthy book for me to read at that time. Well, I'm at that time. I'm at that time completely. I am fully at that time. And this book is called The Emotionally Healthy Church by Peter, I think it's Scazzero. Yeah, it's Scazzero. And it's a really important book in church ministry about the emotionally healthy church. And it's talking essentially about overcoming, I think, that kind of veneer of ministry, not just in ministers' lives, but in Christian churches where you just kind of pretend everything's fine and you keep going to church and you just never come up for air and you just continue to do things that God didn't ask you to do. You wear yourself out, you wear yourself thin, people are doing the same thing. And it gives these principles of how you are to be emotionally healthy spiritually, not just kind of check your mental health, which is kind of a craze these days, which is fine in its own right. But this is more about spiritually, emotionally health. And I like the encouragement from Tim Keller. I think he wrote a foreword to this. No, it's by Leighton Ford. But there's a couple really good. Here it is. Tim Keller's encouragement for this book says, this book unmasks the super spiritual, right, in many churches and cannot deal honestly with the depth of spiritual emotional brokenness. That's exactly what a lot of churches need. I think that's what our church needs. I think that's what, in many ways, I need. I need, sometimes we're so spiritual that we create this super spirituality that the Bible finds more foreign than we think. And I think when we start to realize that grace is not from that kind of spirituality, but grace affords true spirituality, to use that phrase of Francis Schaeffer, that's really needed. So the emotionally healthy church, I think, will be a very helpful read for me on a personal level. So those are the 4 books I'm going to read personally. And, like I've said, I've read kind of half of most of these other books on the professional side of things, but excited to read through the rest of them throughout this week and into Sunday. So I hope that's an encouragement for you if you're a minister, some books to consider for healthy ministry, for sabbatical reading times. That's what they're for. these weeks are set aside for ministers for kind of some professional development. They're not meant to be just kind of take the week off. It's kind of a working week in a way, but it's doing something different that you don't have time to do pretty often. And it's a blessing for ministers. We need a Sabbath from time to time during the year, not just relaxing and getting away from doing normal ministry, but doing some other things that refresh us as well. And when we don't do that, we start to get burned out. And then we start to get embittered, or we don't do ministry from a healthy, holy place. We start doing it from a very selfish or self-pitying place. And that just doesn't help anybody. It hurts a lot of people too. So I'm so grateful for my church here at Westminster allowing me to do this. I'm grateful for the last church I was at, also in Providence Presbyterian out in Lubbock, Texas, that would let me have that time to really engage in those things in my own life. And I'm excited to do that. So I hope that's helpful for you. Until next time, signing off.